right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the August 3rd Thursday Web Forum for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS partnership. As always, my name is Hillary Morris, and I will be your host today. Admit some people from the lobby here, make sure everybody's in. So we host this web forum on the third Thursday of every month right here at 10 a.m. Eastern Time as an opportunity for your SECAS staff to share the latest updates on the blueprint, get input and involvement from folks like y'all, and highlight exciting science and action in the world of landscape conservation in the Southeast and Caribbean. Here's our agenda for today. I'll start out by introducing our speaker, who will present for 30 to 45 minutes or so on our monthly topic. We'll have time afterward for Q&A and discussion, and then I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar so you know what to expect. As a heads up, you probably saw I am recording this webinar just for the couple of folks who inevitably wanted to attend but had a conflict. So just be aware that that recording and transcription's running in the background. Any questions or comments before we proceed with introductions? All right, hearing none, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kevin Kroeger of Silvestrum Climate Associates. He works on climate mechanisms and nature-based solutions with a focus on coastal wetlands. And he's going to be discussing today how a deeper understanding of carbon flux within coastal wetlands ecosystems can inform best practices for management. So take it away, Kevin.
All right. Thanks, Hillary. I appreciate the invitation, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Yes, my name's Kevin Kroeger. I recently left the USGS office in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, where I spent quite a bit of time studying carbon cycle processes in coastal ecosystems, particularly salt marshes. Everything I'll talk about here is also relevant to mangroves and other intertidal vegetated wetlands. So the objective of the work has been to help inform decision making at any organizations or agencies that manage these kinds of ecosystems. What we're trying to do is understand the value of the carbon sequestration that occurs in these ecosystems as another service that they provide, and to add that value to the many other ones that everyone here already knows about. There is a voluntary carbon market that's international that can bring monetary value to the carbon sequestration under some circumstances. So I left USGS and I've joined Silvestrum Climate Associates to work with them to help to guide implementation of blue carbon at the project level or at the level of management entities, whether that's state or federal governments. And so at Silvestrum, they're a small company. They've been around for about 10 years. They have very international distribution and quite a lot of work in the United States and Caribbean as well. I'm working closely with Steve Crooks in particular, and they have projects in which they're helping to guide implementation of blue carbon in state-level greenhouse gas inventories for the state of Oregon, Washington, New Jersey, Massachusetts, North Carolina. And I'll talk about the North Carolina work a little bit later. So a lot of work in the United States as well. And so I want to bring what we've learned in the science to help with organizations implement and possibly credit these kinds of activities. So a brief introduction to blue carbon. What do we mean when we talk about blue carbon? These ecosystems are very productive. They take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere rapidly. A substantial portion of that uptake is stored in the soil. or in vegetation, in the case of mangroves, where it can remain for a very long time, representing a removal of CO2 from the atmosphere and a mitigation of climate change if we can create enhancements of those rates. And so that's kind of the key pathway when we're talking about blue carbon, is storage of organic matter in soil or in biomass. In some cases where the wetlands are degraded, they can begin to lose their carbon stock back to the atmosphere, and that can be as either carbon dioxide or methane. And so if we take actions to improve the condition of the wetlands, in many cases we can reduce or cease those emissions, and that can be of significant benefit as well. And then lastly, we're finding that most of the carbon that's taken up from the atmosphere is not stored in the soil, but rather is exported to the coastal ocean due to tidal exchange. And that's both respired inorganic carbon and it's detrital organic carbon. And this is a pretty hot topic at the moment, and we're working quite vigorously to understand this flux and to determine whether it may be a long-term carbon sequestration pathway as well. So how does blue carbon fit in the bigger picture in terms of mitigating climate change? Here we have a graphic from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, showing a scenario of climate change mitigation this century, with total emissions in the heavy black line. At this point, as folks probably are aware, we haven't reduced emissions as fast as needed in order to meet targets by the end of the century. And so there's a lot of focus now on pathways to remove carbon dioxide or methane from the atmosphere. So the idea is not that removals can substitute for emissions reductions, but rather they can complement the emissions reductions, which are really the critical piece that has to happen. So removals can include changes in the way we manage landscapes or water. And so that can include agricultural settings, forests, oceans, and also wetlands. And that's shown here in brown. The yellow here, that's a speculative magnitude. And that's the concept that we may be able to design new approaches, engineered approaches for removing carbon dioxide. So all are important, none are sufficient on their own. So in summary, and I'll talk in more detail about each of these items, we, the broader community, find that tidal wetlands in the conterminous U.S. Are a sink for 86 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in the 10-year period ending in 2035. When wetlands are disturbed, impounded, or drained, they become high intensity sources for greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. In the range of about a third of U.S. tidal wetlands, or in the potentially tidal wetland area, are in degraded condition due to drainage or impoundment behind dikes or transportation infrastructure. That condition represents a significant opportunity to avoid emissions, human-caused emissions, by improving the management condition of the wetlands. There may be significant methane emission reduction opportunities within that. And finally, tidal wetlands export the majority of their net carbon dioxide uptake from the atmosphere to the coastal ocean, and the magnitude and ocean storage are not yet sufficiently assessed or inventoried. So hydrological restorations first is a widespread opportunity. Throughout the history of land development, There's been a lot of construction of transportation infrastructure along the coasts, often cutting off tidal exchange between estuaries and wetlands and the coastal ocean. In humid climates, where there's a significant amount of net rainfall, those tidal restrictions or other kinds of barriers will tend to impound freshwater runoff that's coming from the watershed towards the ocean and raise the water table and cause freshening. So we convert what was a tidal saline wetland into a low salinity or fresh wetland with a high water table. These have impaired ability to store carbon in the soil. They may lose some of their carbon stock, and they may become important methane sources to the atmosphere. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So these are very widespread. This is just a snapshot of a portion of the coast of Delaware. Here we have an unintended tidal restriction and impoundment of a former tidal saline marsh that's now freshened. And again, these can be important methane sources. There are a lot of intentional dike building and impoundments as well. And then we have drained areas that are now agricultural or developed land. And those have important carbon and greenhouse gas consequences as well. So why are these important settings? Here in the top left, we have a diagram showing some of the carbon processes in a natural wetland in healthy condition. We have tidal exchange, which brings seawater in and washes out reaction products, including sulfide, keeping the salt marsh or mangrove functioning well. As the wetland responds to sea level rise, it gains soil volume, represented as elevation gain, which tends to help it maintain its elevation relative to sea level. And this represents carbon sink, accumulation of new carbon in the soil. Because of the saline or brackish tidal exchange, there's a lot of sulfate available from the seawater in the pore spaces of the soil. And so the microorganisms, once they're under anaerobic conditions in the soil, most of their respiration is through sulfate reduction. And sulfate reduction doesn't generate methane, and so we have very low methane emissions under these higher salinity conditions. Once again, if we tidally restrict or impound and cause freshening, we block that sulfate supply to the wetland. We raise the water table, and since there's not sufficient sulfate, there tends to be more methanogenesis and methane emission. So this is not to imply that freshwater wetlands are a problem in terms of climate. Here we're talking about wetlands that were saline and have been converted into these kinds of altered ecosystems. So these methane emissions are an opportunity for emissions reductions. Many freshwater wetlands are quite old, and if they're left undisturbed, they have so much soil carbon accumulated over such a long period of time that CO2 sink and retention tends to overcome the methane emissions that are occurring and causing apparent warming on a short time scale. And I'm not going to get deep into that, but I'll just say that many freshwater wetlands are old and they tend to be cooling climate, even if you see methane emissions. So the other common management condition is drainage. And so if we build a dike or other structure to prevent seawater inundation, and we put in gates or pumps and ditches to lower the water table, what we get is a conversion to an upland soil We have introduction of oxygen from the atmosphere into the soil, and that tends to drive a high rate of aerobic respiration of microorganisms in the soil, converting that old carbon stock into carbon dioxide, which is emitted in the atmosphere. In both of these management conditions, they tend to lose elevation as well, so they become very non-resilient landscapes. And in the bottom left, we have a graph here showing the impact on global climate of management actions on 1 hectare of ecosystem. And don't worry about these units because they're very strange. But the point is, the negative numbers are cooling and the positive numbers are warming. And you can see upland forest and mangrove and salt marsh and seagrass as carbon dioxide sinks, tending to cool the climate. When we convert these into either drained or impounded wetlands, the associated emissions can be much, much stronger than the natural sinks we get. And so the impact of restoration can be quite large per unit area. And we evaluated that with measured data at a location, a National Park Service site on the Cape Cod National Seashore in Massachusetts called the Herring River. This is about a 1,000-acre diked and drained, and in some cases impounded wetland in quite degraded condition, and it's undergoing restoration now. And briefly, what we see under impounded conditions, invaded with Phragmites, we see quite high methane emissions compared to the natural wetlands nearby. There is still a strong carbon sink and accumulation of soil and biomass in the Phragmites wetland, but that sink is even stronger in a Spartina wetland adjacent. And so the total in dark blue here shows that we have a moderate warming due to the existence of the Phragmites invaded impounded wetland, and we have very strong cooling due to the presence of the Spartina wetland. So the difference between these two lines, blue lines, is the value, the blue carbon value of that management action of restoring the tidal flows. Working with Jim Holmquist and others at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, we've been working to map these opportunities. It turns out that impounded wetlands, drained wetlands are not well represented in the land cover databases that are available. So we're trying to close that gap by evaluating at scale where we have these kinds of impounded and drained wetlands and where what the magnitude is of the opportunity for blue carbon implementation. So this is a tool that's available as an interactive map. Though I'll say it's not complete, it represents a lot of what's there. We still have ambitions to do more. I'm also working with folks at the University of Connecticut, Jay Zhu and Zhusheng Yang and others, to develop remote sensing products that will help us to track the condition of wetlands. They have a product called Decode, which uses what's called dense time series analysis of Landsat images. So it uses all of the high quality images available to detect greenness, water cover, and condition changes across all of the wetlands in the United States. So at the moment, we have the years 1986 to 2023 covered in a product that's in review now. So this is a very powerful tool. It allows examination of change due to gradual processes like sea level rise, or episodic processes like human actions or storm impacts. And we're finding that increasingly storm impacts are particularly powerful in terms of driving loss of wetlands in the United States. So of course the rate of loss is concentrated particularly in the Louisiana and Gulf area. On the left here, we're showing time series of Landsat images, showing the green up in the summertime and the green down in the wintertime. And then in this very small wetland here on Cape Cod, we have a opening of a tidal restriction and restoration of tidal flow. And the point here is that the decode model very readily detects that change in wetland condition. So how about tidal exports of dissolved carbon? This is very much a frontier in blue carbon. So as I mentioned, a substantial part of the net uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is exported through tidal exchange and pore water exchange to the coastal ocean. Here we're particularly focused on the inorganic carbon because excuse me, a lot of the respiration in the soil, as I mentioned, is through sulfate reduction. Sulfate reduction generates bicarbonate, which is a form of alkalinity. Bicarbonate has a very long residence time of thousands of years in the ocean. That bicarbonate production and release, to some degree, is coupled with storage of the sulfide, which contains the acid in the soil. So we store the acid, we release the alkalinity, and that alkalinity can help to enhance the amount of carbon stored in an innocuous way in the ocean. So this can be an important pathway for carbon sequestration. My colleague Steve Crooks has noted that many blue carbon projects are on the cusp of market feasibility. What that means is they may not be large enough in area or intense enough in terms of emissions reduction opportunity to make them valuable enough in terms of carbon credits that can be sold to overcome the cost of doing the project and implementing it in a carbon market. So that's what's referred to as feasibility. If the costs are greater than the generated value, then it's not a feasible project for a carbon market. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not valuable projects. They can have huge values ecologically, of course, and even if the value is not sold as a carbon credit, it can be represented in greenhouse gas inventories and help governments to meet their emissions reductions goals. And it also is quite valuable to be able to talk with all interested parties in an ecological management action about the climate value of restoration or conservation. So still, the market feasibility is important because that can bring an additional source of investment in management actions. So what we're thinking is that this added value, assuming that that the conclusion ultimately is that yes, this is a significant source of carbon sequestration, and we can work out the details on how it can be credited, and crediting agencies make the decision to go ahead and include it in their market methodologies, then this may increase the value sufficiently that marginal projects now become feasible in the market. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how this is generated. This graphic is basically showing what I mentioned before. We have sulfate reduction causing bicarbonate export, and we have pyrite and other metal sulfide formations storing acid in the soil. And this is all, the flux is all driven by pore water exchange and the biological and microbial processes happening in the pore water. So working with folks at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, including Alec Wang and Qipei Shanguan and Sophie Kuhl and others, several years ago, we developed a method to monitor this flux. This has been a challenge since the 1960s to measure exports of carbon from tidal wetlands. This is related to the outwelling hypothesis. Turns out it's very hard to measure because it's extremely variable in time. It's a difference between the fluxes into the wetland with flood tides and the fluxes out of the wetlands with ebb tides. And the net of those is different with every tide. And so what we found is we had to develop a method to monitor the flux continuously at high frequency over extended time. So we've been doing this. We did this for several years at the Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And there are several other groups around the country who are using a related method or the same method at several sites. And we have more than 20 site years of data now using this continuous flux monitoring. And so this is giving us the ability to understand the flux much better. And so the way we do this is we deploy a flow sensor shown here on the top right, an acoustic flow sensor at the mouth of a tidal creek, and we deploy chemistry sensors as well, and we make predictions of the carbon and alkalinity concentrations in the water every few minutes based on relationships to the chemistry sensors. And we do a whole lot of corrections to the water budget, and then we calculate instantaneous fluxes every few minutes. And here's a result from Sophie Kuhl, a PhD student at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We've named this method EXITS for Extended Eulerian Time Series. And you can see over these 4 years, there's some variability in dissolved organic carbon flux and inorganic carbon flux. We get in the end about 400 grams of carbon per meter squared per year exported. And that's in comparison to in the range of about 200 grams of carbon stored per square meter per year in the soil. So it's a big flux. There's a lot of literature out there these days using short-term measurements of this flux. And as I mentioned, we found that the flux rate is highly variable in time. And so what we're showing here in red is a synthesis of all of the fluxes globally across salt marshes and mangroves using those short-term methods. And you can see they're quite variable. And we're comparing that in blue to what we observed over a 4-year period at just one site at the Wacoit Bay NER. And the point here is that the range of fluxes is about the same at one site as the observed range of fluxes globally. And so what that indicates is mostly we're looking at temporal variability, not spatial variability. And these short-term observations don't tell us what the annual rate is. So unfortunately, at this point, we're stuck with some extended measurements. How am I doing on time, Hillary? A little bit more?
You're good. Yeah, you have more time. Yep.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just say briefly that through some thought experiments through first principles about what we know about how these wetlands function, we can expect that many of the same management actions that would reduce methane emissions, that would enhance soil carbon accumulation, that would restore ecological integrity and health to a salt marsh or a mangrove, would also enhance the storable export of bicarbonate alkalinity from the wetland. So as I mentioned, in natural wetland, the redox conditions tend to favor sulfate reduction in the soil and alkalinity export and storage in the ocean of carbon. If we drain a wetland, it's very well known that acid sulfate soils are often formed when wetlands are drained. That's because we're oxidizing all of the stored pyrite and other forms of metal sulfide in the soil, and that releases acidity, forms sulfuric acid, and the sulfuric acid is exported to the ocean. This is what I would call a negative alkalinity export. And so we're consuming alkalinity through this management action, and we're going to tend to cause the ocean to release more CO2 to the atmosphere. That's in addition to the CO2 that's already going to be released to the atmosphere due to oxidation of the soil carbon. So this is very bad for climate and very bad for the wetlands. These are a great opportunity for a restoration. And lastly, if we tidally restrict and impound and cause a wetland to tend to become a methane source, again, impairing its ability to store soil carbon, we also block sulfate introduction from the seawater, thereby preventing sulfate reduction and alkalinity generation. And so we expect that will reduce the lateral export of storable carbon. So we're examining these processes at national scale, as I mentioned. This is under a NASA carbon monitoring system project that's ongoing, and pulls in all of the known high frequency extended time series flux data. And the idea there is to use all that high frequency flux data, synthesize the data, which we're doing now. Chipe Shangguan at Hui is leading that synthesis. Patty Oikawa at California State East Bay is leading the development of a model based on the synthesized data. And the idea then is we can use the mapped and remotely sensed data to implement the model and understand what this flux is at scale, and ultimately understand what the opportunities are for management. So the last topic on lateral fluxes, we're beginning a new project in North Carolina to assess this carbon export and storage in the coastal ocean. That project is funded by the North Carolina Coastal Federation. It's collaborative with Pew Charitable Trusts, Duke University, the state of North Carolina, the USDA, NRCS, USGS, and some other academic institutions, including Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and also a company called Vesta. I meant to mention at the introduction, in addition to Silvestrum, I'm working with a company called Vesta, and they are focused on implementing marine carbon dioxide removal projects, which I'll talk a little bit more about soon. But I've brought these two companies together, and I think we're headed in some very fruitful directions in terms of climate change mitigation and coastal management. So we're about to initiate this fall data collections in North Carolina. Our primary study site will be here, what we're calling the Gateway Salt Marsh site, which is in the North River, close to Morehead City. And this property was recently purchased by the North Carolina Coastal Federation, and they own quite a bit of other coastal properties, and ecological conservation and restoration is their mission. And so we're helping them and the state to understand what the implications in terms of blue carbon will be of their decisions, and also helping to introduce this lateral export into the state level greenhouse gas inventory. So this will be the first one nationally, and I believe the first one in the world inventory to include lateral exports. And of course, the outcome will depend on what the science tells us, but we'll interpret this project in the context of the broader synthesis within the NASA project. So we're looking at some change processes. There's very evident edge erosion here. So we'll evaluate what the carbon consequences are of that edge erosion and of management actions that might be taken to mitigate it. There's evidence that these ponds here and these open water areas here are expanding. These ponds here are quite clearly caused by this ditch and throw operation, which happened many decades ago, impounding this water here. When the water becomes impounded on the platform, the high water table causes sulfide accumulation and vegetation mortality and respiration and erosion of the carbon stocks. So this is a loss to the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. And so there are several or a few management options for this kind of process, which may indicate incipient loss due to interactions between sea level rise and human modifications of hydrology. Those could include runneling, very shallow temporary ditches to reconnect open water areas to creeks or edges, and this may help to revegetate, or thin layer placement, adding sediment to raise the elevation relative to rising seas. In North Carolina, we're also going to revisit a thin layer placement experiment that was done almost 10 years ago. This was led by Jenny Davis and Carolyn Curran and Natalia Mushegian. I don't know Natalia. Sorry for butchering her name. But we're going to revisit this site. They've already published a paper on this beneficial use of dredge material experiment. These are quite large plots, 3 meters by 8 meters, with different levels of thin layer placement, of dredge, and also controls. So we'll revisit, we'll do new coring and evaluations of elevation change and the chemistry and the vegetation robustness to help to inform ongoing decisions on use of beneficial use of dredge material or other sediment additions to marshes as a way to mitigate elevation loss. So lastly, related to that, we're doing work on addition of other minerals besides dredge material as a component of the material added to a wetland to raise the elevation. So what I'm talking about here is a subset of a process called ocean alkalinity enhancement or enhanced mineral weathering. So why would we want to enhance the rate at which minerals are weathering? The reason is that on very long time scales, millions of years, when carbon dioxide concentrations increase in the atmosphere, it results in more carbonic acid formation in water in contact with the rocks that make up the earth. And that carbonic acid reacts with alkaline rocks in particular. So there are a lot of silicate-bearing ultramafic rocks, they're called, but also carbonate rocks like limestone. Those will react with the carbonic acid and produce bicarbonate, the same form of carbon that I mentioned that's produced by sulfate reduction and exported from wetlands naturally. So this is another natural process that causes alkalinity to be exported from the land to the ocean. That represents sequestration of carbon dioxide. There's carbon dioxide contained in this bicarbonate molecule. But it helps to buffer the pH of seawater as well, since this is a form of alkalinity being the opposite of acidity. So this is a beneficial process that would help to mitigate climate change, but it's going to take millions of years. So there's a concept that we can mine these minerals like olivine or basalt or limestone, and crush them into fine material, and then place them in the environment where they will react faster because of the larger surface area, and the resulting bicarbonate will be exported to the ocean and stored. So this is kind of the opposite of what we have now, which is just direct dissolving of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the ocean. That produces carbonic acid and ocean acidification. So this pathway is beneficial. This pathway is harmful. We want to push it more towards the beneficial one. We've already done an experiment in which we added finely ground olivine to some salt marsh plots in the Herring River estuary at the National Park Service on Cape Cod. And we did see, as expected, relatively rapid reactivity. The vegetation didn't mind at all. It responded positively in terms of root biomass production. That was probably simply because of addition of sediment, which does tend to stimulate root production. So the idea would be to mix in some of these minerals with a beneficial use or other sediment addition to raise the elevation and conserve a wetland. This will conserve the carbon stocks for longer, conserve the ecology for longer, and the reactivity of the minerals will help to buffer ocean acidity and store carbon dioxide. And we believe there's quite a bit of potential for this globally, particularly through engagement with the Army Corps of Engineers with their objective to substantially increase their beneficial use activities. So we're going to do a field trial. It's the pending start will be this coming spring at a Spartina salt marsh location in the Herring River. We can see here, this is the dike under construction. They're removing the dike. They replaced it with a temporary bridge. They're going to put in a permanent bridge, and then they'll have total control over water flows, water levels, tidal exchange soon. Within months, they'll have that completed, and then they will start a very gradual, careful, adaptive management approach to introducing tidal flows. The problem is that this 900 and something acres of former salt marsh is mostly subsided by anywhere from a half a meter to a meter. There may be a deficit of around a half a million cubic yards of sediment volume within this system, and we don't expect very much in the way of natural deposition to occur. There's not a lot of sediment supply. So this is an ecological restoration that needs a lot of external sediment. And as many people here already know, once we've tidally restricted or diked a wetland for some period of time, they're pretty much all subsided in this way. And so we need a lot of sediment in order to do these restorations. And so what we're thinking is these additional sediment sources can help to create that volume. So we'll add a 50% mixture in sand of olivine and place it on a half-acre plot. We'll do the same with limestone, and then we'll do a control that's just sand. We're going to do about 10 centimeter additions. And then we will monitor the exports using the same method we use for natural alkalinity and carbon exports. And we'll assay oyster larvae settlement and survival. We'll assay effects on the soil, the existing soil carbon, and evaluate transport of metals from the olivine into biota and determine whether that's a good idea to do or not, and at what level it's safe. The limestone, on the other hand, doesn't have significant metal content. So it may be a safer alternative, though we expect it to be less effective in terms of carbon capture than the olivine. So we'll do a lot of ecological monitoring along with, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
Yeah.
We do have probably 10 minutes or so for questions. So if folks would like to unmute and jump in the chat, there is the raise hand feature on the top. We do have a fairly big crowd, so it might be best if we do use the raise hand just to direct traffic here, or you're welcome to drop your chat into the chat, and I will read that aloud for the benefit of the recording, and we can handle things that way. So I'll pause and see if we have any questions. A question from Mark in the chat about whether you were tracking heavy metal export.
Yeah, good question. olivine contains nickel, particularly, also some chromium and cobalt at much lower levels. So the nickel is a concern from olivine. The level of safety, the level at which it can be added while staying within safe thresholds is not entirely clear. So yeah, we'll track it into the grass, into the soil, and into invertebrates around in the marsh as well. We'll be monitoring shellfish farther out in the estuary, though this is relative to the scale of the estuary. This is very small, and so we don't expect detectable long-range transport. But yeah, olivine may be more suitable for farther offshore than in the salt marsh because of that issue. But we need to do the experiments to find out.
Great question, Mark. Thank you for that. Anyone else?
Anyone have any blue carbon experiences they want to talk about?
That would be welcome too.
Any projects you're contemplating or are curious about what the carbon value might be?
Here's an interesting question or suggestion from Michelle Matson in the chat. She's saying that she's in the business of working with U.S. Army Corps of Engineer applicants on crediting compensatory mitigation for waters and wetlands through things like restoration and enhancement. Crediting requires a method of measuring net gain. She's thinking that there may be opportunities here for a crediting market to support coastal restoration. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I wonder if you can, if you don't mind, you could unmute and tell me a little bit more about that. So you're talking about markets other than carbon markets, I think. Is that right?
Well, I mean, other markets are pretty well established, at least for waters, wetlands, and species, right? And so I'm part of the planning committee for the Environmental Markets Conference. Used to be the Mitigation Banking Conference, led by Carlene Bauer. She's amazing. And in the last few years, they've been really looking at other markets, you know, forestry, carbon, etc. And I wasn't able to listen to all of your presentation. I'm very sorry, but I'm going to save the recording when it comes out.
Yeah.
You know, I work in a lot of conditional and functional assessments and sort of defending or identifying the net gain, you know, how to quantify the net gain in functions and services for waters, wetlands, and that's the credits that bankers, for example, get to sell for authorized impacts through the core system. So in this case, and we often, or we can overlap species credits, you know, and there has been discussion about overlapping carbon credits and other things. So one applicant only gets one bucket of credits, right? They can't, you know, you can't sell a carbon credit to one person, a wetland credit to something else for the same acre of wetland. The understanding there is that let's say acre of wetland performs all those functions regardless. You can't split them up. But if if a restoration banker was able to do additional work on an estuary, let's just say, so that they can enhance carbon sequestration, then they would have a more valuable credit, for example. But we have to be able to measure that credit. We have to defend how many credits they get. And so that's what I was trying to, like, when you were going through all of the cool science and monitoring that you're doing, like, how do we use that in a crediting scheme? So that's just where I was going. The Corps is not in that market. EPA is and others, but we can certainly be a partner in approving multi-use banks or multi-use credits like we do with species.
I see. This is super interesting, and Yeah. So in the carbon world, the measurement that you're talking about, the jargon around that is MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification for carbon credits, and it's a very hot topic in carbon dioxide removal, and what we've been focusing on significantly. We have a very well developed monitoring and measurement method, as I don't know if you saw that portion of the talk, but we developed it for the natural exports of carbon and alkalinity from wetlands. So those are important as well. If the Army Corps or somebody else were to do a thin layer replacement project, it would have value in that way, just the natural exports. But what we're talking about is adding these minerals in the beneficial use, and those will generate additional carbon capture. They'll also generate potentially, and it needs modeling and experiments, benefits for the shellfish in the adjacent waters. If they are experiencing stress due to acidification, this will reduce the amount of acid entering the water. And so maybe that's something that could be credited as well. So I think we have the measurement pretty well worked out. By the time we do this experiment at the Park Service, I think we'll have it very well worked out. And I'd love to talk with you more about this additional world, which I'm not really very familiar with. So.
Same. I will definitely reach out, or I'll put my contact information in the chat here, but I would love to connect. The abstracts for the conference for next year, which is in Kentucky, is coming up soon. Push it up to September. And I just think that the audience there would love to hear about the work that you're doing and how they can help fund some of this stuff in order to, get the information that they need to build credits. We're losing waters and wetlands regulation ability. And so these bankers who restore wetlands for species and whatnot are losing their ability to sell credits. So this is another benefit that they can, jump into. They're businessmen, really, but in the form of illustration. So I will reach out. Absolutely. Thank you so much,
Great.
Kevin.
Thank you. I'll drop my email in the chat as well.
Awesome.
Thanks. That's super interesting. Another question from David Norris in the chat about whether you've worked with any local DOT staff. Have you had any success working with them to remove restrictions on roads?
I haven't personally. That's a good question. I've kind of been near it in a couple of different ways. There was someone whose name I'm not remembering right now at the EPA a couple of years ago who was leading an effort to engage with DOT on removing tidal restrictions and trying to map them. I don't know exactly where that went. I'm also aware of an effort that was led by the Fish and Wildlife Service and I think several other agencies to map all of the culverts in the country. Maybe you know about that effort. I've seen a draft of that map, which is just totally packed with dots. It's huge. But unfortunately, they started in the interior of the country and they were working their way out. So I haven't seen an update on that in a couple of years either.
Very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that other than like the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership has their aquatic barrier prioritization tool. And I think that does potentially include culverts and other road-based barriers, not just dams. But I was not aware of a national effort on that scale.
I can look for a contact name if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting to know.
Okay.
And then I think offered in the spirit of sharing a blue carbon project, David Bird is saying that they were looking at taking trees that were blown down from hurricanes and storms and transporting them to stabilize stream channels in the Louisiana marsh, but that project may have lost traction.
That's a good idea. That Steve Crooks has been talking about the idea of using waste wood in that way to shore up or build up wetlands, because that may well store the carbon in that tree as well for extended time.
Well, just given the time, I really appreciate the great questions and discussion. I do want to quickly preview next month's web forum, just so you all know what is coming up next, but then we can pause again at the end to see if any other questions come up, depending on whether Dr. Kroeger needs to move on with his day or can hang out with us a little bit longer. So next month, our webinar will be September 18th, same time, same connection information, or sorry, not same connection information, will still be on Teams, but there will be a new registration link, and I will grab that and drop that in the chat before we wind up today. This is going to be a very different topic. We're going to be learning from Coralie Thomas Hill, who's the tribal liaison with the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, or SGI. And she's going to be talking about SGI's tribal program, which works to incorporate indigenous ecological knowledge into the Institute's conservation and restoration projects, and essentially ensure tribal priorities are considered in all of SGI's work. And with their very broad scope and geography, that's a tall order. So really excited to hear what Coralie has to say. Hope you will tune in for that. And then I always like to end on this slide. You can always get more involved in the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS partnership. Encourage you to sign up for the SECAS newsletter, which you can do on the footer of any page of our website, secassoutheast.org. Your staff would love to hear from you. You can see our remaining full-time staff on our staff page, and our contact information is there. We'd love to help you use the blueprint in your work. If you would like help with a decision, a conservation plan, a letter of support for a grant, we're here to assist you. And if you check out the blueprint and have ideas on how we can improve it, we'd love to hear from you about that as well. So here I will pause for any additional questions while I dig up that registration link for next month. Hearing none, I'm going to say just again a big thank you to Dr. Kroeger for sharing his expertise with us today, and appreciate all of you all tuning in. Hope you learned something. David, I see that you've come on camera. Did you want to chat a little bit more?
Well, I wanted to mention that we did go out and look at those trees and cut into some. We had Hurricane Laura and Delta blew through here on the Kisatchie National Forest and laid down 100,000 acres of trees. And I think they're doing this work in Florida, where they're taking trees and burying them down in the stream channel. So it was almost to the point where we were ready to put them on barges, and then the project collapsed. And I think the wood by now is probably too degraded to go there, but it would have helped us as a forest replant the forest for reforestation. And it will take a long time for us to get those fuels off the forest floor. So it was a compounded problem that I thought we'd had a good solution for, and I wish it would have fallen through with fruition, and we could have accomplished that, because I go down to that marsh as much as I can, and I love it, would love to help preserve it.
Yeah. And presumably the project came apart because of funding, loss of funding?
Not really. You know, the last few years have been really fluid in the amount of changes, and that's about all I can say. There's just been a lot happening in the last couple of years, and for a project like that, you almost have to be ready before it happens.
Yeah.
To utilize the products completely.
It sounds like a brilliant idea, benefiting the forest and the wetland, and the substantial carbon consequences of both.
We had the funding in place. Maybe next time, you know, it's hurricane season, so maybe next month, but I hope not.
Yeah.
I hope you're spared.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting.
Sorry, it sounds like my audio cut out. Am I back?
You're back.
Teams just had a little tantrum. Sorry. Thank you for sharing a little bit more about your project and kind of your vision for that. It's a shame that fell through, but really interesting idea, fodder for the future. We're a little over time, but we got a lot of people hanging on. Are there any other questions for Kevin before we say goodbye?
Well, my email is in the chat. Happy to talk with anyone about these topics.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate your time. Great presentation. Good to see you all. Amy, I see your hand. Oh, no, she's just clapping. Yay, round of applause. All right, everyone, have a fantastic rest of your Thursday and a great weekend. And hopefully we'll see you in September to learn more about SGI's tribal program. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.